Vincent Cushing, meanwhile, was part of a great lineage of demon fighters, the Cushing family, though sadly, and ironically, he was scrubbed from their history for many years, not because of who he was, but what he was, or rather, what he became. Vincent's grandparents were among those who survived the mass slaughter of the Cushing family by vampires in the early 20th century. Prior to this attack, the Cushings had been one of the most influential families throughout Europe due to their knowledge and history of hunting vampires and demons, but eventually the vampires were able to fight back and destroy their influence. Vincent's grandparents subsequently tried to rebuild their family's power in the most unlikely of places, the city of Marsters, a hotspot for vampiric activity, as it was built not only over the cave where Castran, the demon who created vampires, made the book which spawned all vampire breeds, it was also built over a portal to the afterlife for vampires. When creating the vampires, Castran, the most evil and powerful of all demons, also created a small pocket dimension where the souls of any vampire, or indeed any other demonic creation of his, would go when it dies, such as the Turakan and Zoltans. The souls of demons who were loyal to him would also be sent there when they died, including the Lycans and their descendants, werewolves. Certain vampire species even had the power to send their victims into the pocket dimension too when they killed them. The pocket dimension itself was nothing more than a large wasteland with some bodies of water, caves, and a few crumbling temples and villages. It was based on the earth as it was when Castran last walked it. Any life form that died in the pocket dimension would instantly be brought back within the dimension, meaning the vampires and other creatures hunted each other and their victims in there for all eternity. Naturally, this dimension made Marsters a target for vampires, as it was the easiest place to bring vampires back from the dead, and vampires who returned here would be stronger and more formidable. Vincent's grandparents were able to make quite a profit in this town, as their knowledge of vampires, which had been built up before the city of Marsters had even been founded, truly eclipsed everyone else's. In addition to this, Vincent's grandparents had also managed to steal rare magics and enchantments that the Cushing family had built up for centuries, just before their stronghold in Europe had been slaughtered. Sadly, however, for the people of Marsters, this help didn't come free. The Cushings felt terrible at having to charge people for their services, but it was the only way they could regain a footing and re-establish themselves as a major power. Still, in the long run, the Cushings' presence in Marsters did do a lot of good for the town, at least for a few decades. Not only was the vampire population of the town depleted, but knowledge on how to kill them was spread out among the townsfolk to a greater extent than ever before. Sadly, the vampires and other supernatural creatures of the town who wished to harvest the power of Castran's dimension for themselves would ultimately clamp down harder on the Cushings. Whilst Vincent's grandparents were always able to overcome whatever threat came their way, his parents would not be so lucky. Vincent's father, who came from the Cushing side of the family, was always reluctant to follow in his father's footsteps and even tried to quit being a vampire killer several times. He simply did not have the heart or skills for it, and his incompetence eventually led to both he and his wife's deaths when their only son Vincent, born in the year 1965, was just 10 years old. Following their deaths, Vincent vowed to never follow in his predecessor's footsteps so as to avoid a similar fate. His grandparents by then were too old to keep fighting the vampires and the demons who were returning to the town in greater numbers. The vampires that killed his parents made a spectacle of it, stringing their mutilated corpses up in public, which naturally made the rest of the vampire population more bold. The elder Cushings desperately tried to force the young Vincent to carry on their legacy, but this just made him more determined not to. Eventually, his grandparents disowned Vincent and would leave Marsters when Vincent was 18 to try and make contact with other scattered members of the family throughout Europe. Vincent, meanwhile, continued to enjoy his family's wealth and live a lazy life of hedonism throughout his teens and 20s, whilst the city of Marsters was slowly overtaken and became worse than ever before as the vampires and demons became more numerous and confident, having seemingly defeated the Cushings. It wouldn't be until the early 1990s when Vincent's family's past caught up with him. In many ways, it was inevitable. Even though the name Cushing had become a joke in Marsters thanks to their defeat and Vincent's antics, many vampires and demons across Europe still wanted revenge on the family. The survivors of the family for the most part knew this and kept hidden. Vincent's grandparents were the exception, as they wanted to draw the vampires out. Sadly, Vincent foolishly thought that if he didn't bother the vampires and the demons, then they wouldn't track him down. He even had a few demon girls and strippers at his infamous parties in a pathetic attempt to show solidarity with them. Not surprisingly, this did nothing to deter a powerful former vampire king named Eric von Korsen, who had a centuries-old grudge with the Cushing family. Ironically, many centuries ago, he and the Cushings had worked very closely together in taking down the Vandals, the soul-devouring demonic rivals to the vampires' main power base in Europe. This defeat is ultimately what helped the Cushings become such a huge power themselves. Eric, meanwhile, was betrayed by the very same Cushings he had worked with soon after and was driven out of Germany and forced to live life on the road for centuries. Hundreds of years later, he finally was able to have his revenge and destroy the Cushings' power. He then spent the next several decades hunting down as many members of the family as he could, even those who were no longer hunters. He didn't feel his revenge would be complete until the entire family was destroyed. When he finally learned of the existence of Vincent, Eric was disappointed at first. Vincent, seemingly the last of the Cushings as far as he was aware, was a truly wretched end for the once great family. Killing Vincent would, if anything, spare the Cushings of a greater embarrassment. It was then, however, that Eric got a better idea. He would turn the last of the Cushings into a vampire and mentor him into being one of the cruelest, most evil members of their kind. Eric hoped that the horrors Vincent could carry out as a vampire under his guidance would be so great they would eclipse all of the good the family had ever done. The more Eric studied Vincent, the more he felt he would make an effective vampire, given his hatred for his family and his already hedonistic life. When Eric and his vampires attacked Vincent's mansion during the middle of one of his parties, they slaughtered everyone there, except for Vincent, who was turned by Eric himself. Had Eric not been so consumed by hatred, his plan to tarnish the Cushing would have most likely succeeded. Ultimately, however, as a sign of his triumph, Eric burned Vincent's mansion to the ground, destroying many of the Cushing's records and the knowledge they had gathered over the centuries. Unfortunately, the mansion also contained many enchantments and dangerous forms of black magic that the Cushing family had contained over the centuries too. Vincent's grandparents had made sure to preserve them after the family's main base of operations was ripped apart. As soon as they were unleashed thanks to Eric's carelessness, they spread out over Marsters and distorted and mutated many humans, demons, beasts, monsters, and vampires alike. One entire region of the town, which had ironically always been where the rich people had lived, was twisted into a nightmarish, hellish place, as it was naturally closest to Vincent's mansion. Eric himself was hit with a blast of dark magic, which contained the remains of a very powerful demon named Hezekiah. the Cushings had slain over 100 years prior. Hezekiah, like many demons, had the power to live again, provided a certain ritual was performed. The Cushing spell, however, made sure it would remain dead by preventing any other magics from influencing its remains. Eric's actions, however, not only caused the Cushing spell to collapse, but the remains of the demon to be swept up in the subsequent magical storm, which were then fused to Eric himself, transforming him into a freakish hybrid of himself and the demon. He had complete control of his body for the most part, but Hezekiah could still influence his mind to some extent, and gradually, over time, the two beings merged mentally into one monstrous creature. Another spell, meanwhile, latched itself onto Vincent's body after the house's destruction, just as his transformation into a vampire was taking place. This spell had been used by the Cushings to heal their wounds, and therefore it was naturally drawn to Vincent. It tried to revive him at first and purge the curse of vampirism from his body, but sadly it couldn't. No force on this earth could cure vampirism, but the spell fought hard to try and revive its host, and even drew several other stray magics from the area into itself to accomplish its task. In the end, whilst it still wasn't able to cure Vincent, it did tamper with his transformation. It allowed him to retain a small aspect of his humanity, namely his conscience and morals, such as they were. Sadly, the spell could never be replicated, as it had been the result of not only a rare healing spell, but the combination of several other magics that fused themselves to his body, all of which had been gathered by the Cushings over hundreds of years, and many of which no longer existed anywhere else. Still, when Vincent rose from the makeshift grave Eric had made for him outside of the now burnt-out ruins of the mansion, he wasn't just any regular vampire. He could think beyond his bloodlust and sadism. At first, Vincent was terrified of what he had become, and fled into the city of Marsters. He didn't even know where he was running, but drawn by the dark magics within him, he fled to the section of Marsters that had been overrun by the monsters. There, he rescued his only true friend, Alan Stanner, from being devoured by his own son, who had transformed into a twisted, magical creature. Alan had been like a father to Vincent, encouraging him to live life the way he wanted, rather than always doing what his grandparents demanded. However, even Alan had grown tired of Vincent's reckless behaviour recently, though unlike his grandparents, he never abandoned him. Unfortunately, there was nothing Vincent could do to help his old friend's son, but he was able at least to get Alan to safety, after which Alan would use his vast wealth to construct a new base of operations for Vincent to work from, under the surface of the city. Unlike the other members of his family, Vincent didn't view being a vampire as a curse, as he was, after all, able to control his thirst thanks to his morality. In addition to this, his breed could also exist in the sun too. If anything, he embraced it for a short while, though he did use his powers to help people from the start. Initially, it was really more about Vincent wanting to play the hero for his own ego, and simply being more willing to now that he had vampiric powers and abilities. He was arrogant, cocky, and reckless, and not above boasting to those he saved. He even came up with a nickname for himself, the Guardian of the Night. For a while he was even a celebrated hero, until it was discovered that he was a vampire. The reality of what he had become soon began to set in, when even those he had rescued would shun him for his nature. Vincent came to realize that he could never have a family, that he would outlive all of his friends, that he would always be hunted both by his own kind as a freak, and even by the people he helped. Even his own family, if they ever found out what became of him. He soon became so depressed he even tried to kill himself, until Stanner talked him out of it, though it was only because he still hoped Vincent could help cure his son. The two's relationship, despite Vincent saving him, had soured, not because Vincent was a vampire, but because Stana blamed him and the Cushings for what had happened to his son. Ironically, it was only after his failure to save a young girl from a particularly brutal vandal that Vincent soon became more of a genuine hero than a braggart. For the first time, Vincent saw what his reckless and foolish actions had caused when the vandal literally tore her in two in front of him. Determined to never let this happen again, Vincent became a more serious, thoughtful, and genuinely noble, as well as quiet hero. In time, he would genuinely win round the people of Marsters' acceptance and gratitude, despite his vampiric nature. Aside from Stana, Vincent also worked with a number of others in this war against vampires and supernatural creatures in Marsters. Among these included Sarah Brooke, a young beast woman who enjoyed hunting paranormal creatures to satisfy her bloodlust, former zombie master Leon Morel, who had come from a long line of zombie masters in Tahiti and had moved to Marsters when he was 20. At first, he created zombies as slaves to battle the vampires around the city. He only used the bodies of criminals and murderers to accomplish this. Unfortunately, however, some of the zombies were soon able to break free from his control, leading to a massive zombie population in Marsters, which served as a rival faction to the vampires. Morale was desperate to make amends for what he had unleashed, and became one of Vincent's closest allies. Finally, the vampire's main sidekick was the kind-hearted former librarian named Laura de Lucy, who had also been given magical powers from the wave of magics created from the destruction of the Cushings mansion, though her powers were only minimal. She soon became Vincent's closest friend. Much like Claudia, Vincent also built up a large rogues gallery in the city too, though his arch-enemy was always Eric, who, in his new identity, went under the alias of Deviant. Sadly, Stana soon became one of his deadliest enemies after being infected by a demon. Blaming Vincent for ruining his life, he would make it his mission to torment him, though, in spite of this, he would still, now and again, ally himself with Vincent when dealing with the bigger danger of Stana's son, who was truly one of the most dangerous creatures in the city.